G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on chess statistics. In these videos I cover something which is not particularly about the game of playing of chess, but more to do with analysis of databases of games, accuracy of play, how often certain positions occur, and so on. So in this video, what I'm going to be looking at is the probability and results you get from endgames. Now, this work is inspired by fairly old, let me just make the video, here we go, this is from Carsten and Muller. They did this 25 years ago, 2001, I believe is when they published their book, Fundamental Chess Endings. And this is data on the percentage frequency of different types of endgames. Now, you can see there, I think this material is referenced on quite a lot of websites. You'll see exactly the same data, which I'm sure it's been updated since then, but I thought I'd give a shot at looking at it and looking at it a bit differently. You can see back in the day when I read this, I've actually highlighted some sort of positions, rook versus rook, endgames at 8.45%, but then you see the next line has got rook plus pawn versus rook, 0.67%. Is that included in that? So the idea is that he's kind of summarized the data, and generally what people have drawn from this is that rook endgames are the most common endgame which occurs. Minor piece endgames quite common, and then you see up the top there pawn endings 2.87% and king plus pawn versus king 0.23%. So one thing to think about is that he doesn't have the sort of the score in this, but you can frame your training, for instance, in endgames. What are the most important? Rook endgames, people know that. But actually, obviously, king and pawn endgames, you also have to have a very solid understanding of, because at the end of the day, is a flow from the more complicated endgames with more pieces into the end of the day, you may actually hit the king and pawn endgames. Right, so what I'm trying to do is similar analysis to what Carsten Muller has done and just see where the numbers lie. What I've done, as usual, let's go across to my Ubuntu capture screen. Right, okay, cool. Now, I've run it already. I'll just give you a bit of a sort of a flavor of what I've been doing. Now, I have various chess databases. I've used Casabase once again. I've filtered it to games of greater than 2,400 by both players, and that leaves me with about 1 million games. It's just the first stab at it. And then I have used Scoutfish repeatedly. We'll just go back up to the top, just give you a sense of what it was actually doing. So this is the idea, right? This is king and pawn endgames, and Carsten Muller didn't distinguish between different types of number of pawns, right? So basically, I'm just going to say you got a king and on both sides, and then you got 8 pawns versus 8 pawns, 8 pawns versus 7 pawns, and so on. And obviously, some of them are the reverse of the other, and you sort of count all the way down to single king and king. And you can see that here. Here's 8 pawns versus 8 pawns. Here's king versus king. Here's king versus 3 pawns, and you can see I put that in the same search. Right, this is the idea of, if you remember what I did talk about Scoutfish, you can search for material. This searches for material both ways, and then but when I actually do the calculation, I'll flip the score of the black versus white to give you the sort of the percentage thing. And then Carsten Muller said he had 2 half moves of each position, so I did the same thing. So this is the material you're searching for, and then you search for a streak. You search for that position twice. So that position, that's 8 pawns versus 8 pawns. If that's on the board for 2 moves, then I'll count that as that endgame exists. Now, this kind of helps because it filters out things where, it's a piece exchange or a pawn exchange, and actually you quickly go from, rather than going 8 versus 8 and 8 versus 7, 7 versus 7, you actually go from 8 versus 8 to 7 versus 7 if it's a sort of a direct trade, right? So I throw that all in there, and then obviously you search, and it's telling you how many games come back, 13 games, 8 versus 8, right? 3,968 games of king and 4 pawns versus king and 4 pawns. That's great. So it's actually, you're getting a sense of how many of these games, and goes all the way down and then calculates some elementary statistics for those different end games. So what I'm going to do now is we'll just quickly go to, I did some charts. I mean, this has got sort of the meat of the analysis and the results, as it were. I've done this in Excel. I couldn't get LibreOffice to work quite as nicely over there, so you can see it, make it really bigger. No, so I'll do the other chart first, actually. So this is the frequencies, by the way. Frequency of pawn endgames. So you can see what we've got here. We have got the different king and pawn endgames ranked by frequency. And you can see that there's 2 ways of looking at it. One is how often does that pawn endgame occur? And the most frequently occurring pawn endgame, that's the orange bars, is king and 2 pawns versus a king about 4,500 times. Now this isn't a database of a million, so that's about 0.5% of the time. Next most frequent, king and pawn versus king, and then king and 3 pawns versus king 3 pawns, king 3 pawns versus king 2 pawns. You can see that this gives you a fairly, does actually give you a good sort of profile of, you know, these are the end games you'd expect the most. And then as you get to more and more pawns, well, often you don't experience that end game so often, and they are less frequent. However, that's only half the story, because the point is that a lot of the king and pawn versus king end games will actually have come from a king and 2 pawns versus king and pawn, or a king and pawn versus king and pawn. So I think so effectively you'd be double counting if you added up all of them. So the second line, the blue line, the blue bars, is actually, that's the first time a pawn endgame occurred, and counts it once, right? And you can see in that case it's actually fairly consistent. You know, there's about 7 or 8, all these endgames here, which is the first entry point for a king and pawn endgame. Now it can't have been from a king and pawn endgame with more pawns on it, right? It's going to have dropped into that endgame from, you know, a rook endgame or a knight endgame or a queen endgame or whatever, right? And that's the first pawn endgame it hits. So to accurately count the number of pawn endgames, you just add up those numbers. And actually, scroll down a bit. So there's the raw, how many times that endgame has occurred. And here is the first time that occurred. And we get 22,208, which is about 2.2%. Now, if we go all the way back, the Carsten and Muller book, pawn endings 2.87%. So that's a bit lighter, but it's still within the ballpark. And he's got king plus pawn versus king 0.23%. I've got 2.5 or 2.6%. So you can see the, I mean, you wouldn't expect, you know, there'll be a bit of variation, but the probability of different endgames kind of, you'd think it'd be sort of reasonably standard through time, unless there's a big shift in terms of the number of endgames overall which is occurring, or something along those lines, right? So that is the frequency. So now let's have a look at the results. Let me just move that chart out of the way. You can see this is just the data which got spat out by my earlier analysis, right? So now, this is 3 lines of the results, right? So the bottom blue line is where there's equal pawns, and you can see the axis, which I've labeled very, very well, is the number of pawns that you had. So 8 versus 8 pawns, equal pawns, 50%. In fact, I don't know why from the white side it's actually giving you a bit more than 50% in all these cases where it's, you know, king and 1 pawn versus king, 1 pawn, and so on, right? And then if you add a pawn, then the stronger side obviously wins, and that's between 60 and 80% winning, depending on how many pawns. So it looks like 4 versus 3 pawns is probably one of the better amounts to have. Of course, it depends where the positions come from, right? The idea there. However, so if you're an extra pawn in like a 3 versus 2, you know, you'd expect to be winning. And then you go 2 extra pawns, then, you know, you're in 90% win rate. And it's probably, there's probably like a few exceptions there where it's probably a stalemate or something like that, or double pawns or so on, because otherwise you'd expect those positions to be winning. Okay, so that's the statistics, kind of matching what Carsten Muller had. And as I say, it's a bit more granular than his work, trying to actually look at the number of pawns. And then, so what this does is I was trying to like visualize that. So, and I will look at the more simplified one first. May not display too well here. I'll try and attach the video. Okay, so you can see here, this is the simpler version, and it's just linking them all up. You can see what you end up with is a sort of a strip down the left-hand side of all the equal pawn endgames. You can see the top one there, 7 versus 7, 6 versus 6, and then it goes yellow 5 versus 5 because it's a slightly winning position for white in that position, which I found a bit weird. So, you know, I had to do some more analysis. 4 versus 4, 3 versus 3, 2 versus 2, 1 versus 1. So you can see this, all this left-hand side here, that's all the equal pawn positions. And you can see the transition, 7 versus 7 goes to 6 versus 6. A thicker arrow means that that's sort of more positions go that way, and some go to 7 versus 6, and this sort of goes all the way down here, so you can see that's going there. And then somebody wins a pawn, and now you're in this middle sort of line of nodes where you've actually got a 1 pawn advantage. And orange, I believe means above 70 or 75%, maybe 70% win rate. So these are advantageous for the stronger side, 6 versus 5, 5 versus 4, 4 versus 3, and so on. And then some of these actually transition across to a 2 pawn advantage. This is probably, you can see it transition, so it's 1 pawn advantage, 2 pawn advantage, goes back to that. So this could well be sort of a delayed exchange of some form. Anyway, once you get over to the left-hand side on this chart, they're all red. And you can see that basically red's 80-85%. I can't remember what cutoff it did, and that means those are pretty much winning because you have a 2 pawn advantage. So that was just that's a simplified overall visualization. And you can see the issue here that as my intention obviously is to add on all the other piece endgames. given that you've got about 20 nodes already for pawns, then I'm going to have to do some simplification to do the rook and the minor piece and the queen and so on, right? However, so this was just the overall summary, and then I've got a much more detailed one, which might find a bit overwhelming. Let's have a look if you can see everything there clearly. I'll just try and move it to the right spot. Fortunately, a bit of it goes off the chart, but that's fine. I'm going to move that over there. That's my little thing. So we can move around and we can see, okay, there's the, let's see, it's going full screen, so you can't quite see the top row where that's a mixture of that top green where you can see the 4 equals 62%. There's a little bit above that. That is the 8 versus 8 pawn endgame, and there's only a few of them. So let's move down to the one below it, which is 7 versus 7, and you can see this is basically trying to capture all that information. 568 of those games, 52% win rate for the white or the stronger side, so that should be, it's kind of close enough to 50, let's say. And then here are all the transitions. 56 of the games go to this 1 pawn advantage to the stronger side, and 57% of those are that's the score, so that's quite positive. And 200 games go to 6 versus 6, and some games go to 5 versus 5, so you can see this line goes all the way down there. And 285 games, about 50% again, 47% score rate. So that could either be going to it just gets finalized, or what I'm missing here is that some of these pawn endgames would transition to a queen and pawn endgame, so I don't capture those. Anyway, so you can see that that's basically the same information as the previous chart, but much more detailed, and actually it's quite entertaining to sort of look through. Okay, let's look at these ones where there's a big pawn advantage, and you can see that 7 versus 5 pawns didn't occur too many times, 47 but 81% score. And you can look down, you can see all these games, different possibilities. 5 versus 2, 93% win rate. Yeah, so it all makes sense in terms of the way it transitions. And that yellow box right down the bottom, which you can't see. Okay, so now you can see it all, and you can see right down the bottom that's one king and pawn and a king, right? This is kings, only kings. You can see it's you can't actually see it. There's one down there. This is the one with 1 pawn versus pawn, and it's 1 pawn versus no pawns, 62%. Yeah, you'd expect that, right? And that sort of goes back to this orange one, which is 2 pawns versus 1 pawn, 70%. And you can see maybe this is in terms of you thinking of end games and end game counts, end games sort of probabilities. This is kind of the interesting, the meat of it, right? Because 3 versus 3 pawns and down on both sides, and then you start throwing rooks and things in, you can sort of understand how things happen. Yeah, so you can see similar chart. It's got the orange band, which is slightly winning. I think it's more than 70%, and that's all the 1 pawn advantages. These greens and yellows are the equals in the pawn side, and the red batch over there is all where it is a larger pawn advantage. Okay, so that's I'll attach those to the video. I think that's kind of just the first step at trying to sort of have a look at looking 2 things here effectively: the frequency of pawn endgames, so you can sort of understand what's important to study. The results of the pawn endgames, the score, so you can understand which positions you should aim for. I mean, obviously, all positions have their own sort of unique features, but at least you have a good sense of what type of pawn endgames are likely to be winning. And then I'll move forwards to adding on pieces to just the pawn endgames. Okay, so that was just introductory. Hope you enjoyed that and seeing the sort of visualization of the king and pawn endgames and kind of verifying, Muller's original analysis from those 20 years ago. And thank you very much for watching.